Hello, I'm Kurt Sylvan. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Southampton, and my main area of interest is epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge. In this video, we're going to be tackling perhaps the biggest question in epistemology, which is, what is knowledge? Now, of course, this is going to be a fairly short video, and so we don't really expect to be able to conclusively answer this question, but what we will do is begin by clarifying the question and looking at two kinds of answers that you might give to this question. Then we'll look at a major problem for one of those kinds of answers, a kind which seeks to explain knowledge in terms of belief. And then finally, we'll look at some responses to this problem and even reflect at the end about whether our lead question can be answered at all. Not everyone thinks that this question has an informative answer. Some people think knowledge just is knowledge. There's nothing more that you can say about it. That's not what I think, but it's a view that we'll be looking at as well toward the end. Okay, so let's begin by clarifying the question that we're asking and thinking in general about two kinds of answers to this question. So the first thing that we need to do is get clearer on what we're talking about in this context when we talk about knowledge. So in this context, we're going to be focusing on knowledge of truths. This is a kind of knowledge that we can express by saying that we know that such and such is the case. So for example, that we know that Socrates was bald. This kind of knowledge is hence expressed by propositional clauses of the form that P, and for that reason is often called propositional knowledge. This might not be the only kind of knowledge that there is. We can also talk about knowing people and cities and knowing how to do things, but in epistemology it's been perhaps the central focus of most of the famous literature that you might be studying in A-level. So what we'll be asking is the question of what it is to know that P. So for example, what it is to know that Socrates was bald. This is sometimes called the Theaetetus problem, the problem of answering this question, because it was first raised in Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus. It's actually worth saying a little bit about some of the answers that Plato considered in the Theaetetus. So one sort of view that he considers is the view that to know that P is to have the correct opinion that P. This is a view that he sets aside because he thinks you can have a correct opinion without having any good reason for holding that opinion. This is sort of analogous to a view that we might think about in the contemporary context, according to which knowledge is true belief. Very few people hold that view, and for the same reason that Plato rejected the view that knowledge is just correct opinion. So a different sort of view that you could adopt is that knowledge is correct opinion held for a good reason. If you look at the Theaetetus, Plato actually doesn't accept this view, and that's because he thinks that your holding of a good reason could itself be accidental or lucky. It could just be that you've latched onto a good reason without really understanding that reason. And he thinks there's no way to explain what it is to understand a reason without appealing to the notion of knowledge. So if you really read the Theaetetus, Plato actually rejects that answer as well. A final kind of view that he talks about in the Theaetetus, or that Socrates talks about on his behalf, is the view that knowledge is perception. Now, in the Theaetetus, the version of this view that's being considered is the view that knowledge is sense perception. Plato doesn't like this view. He's not an empiricist, he's a rationalist, and so he would really not want to identify knowledge with sense perception. But actually, if you look at some of Plato's other work, in particular the Republic, you get a different sort of view about knowledge that analogizes it to perception by viewing it as a kind of intellectual perception of the truth. And the point really of the cave allegory, if you pay close attention to it in the Republic, is to highlight this state of being in a kind of perceptual contact with the truth. So the idea is that when you leave the cave, the world of sense, and enter the world of forms, you then are in sort of direct contact with those forms. Of course, you're not seeing them with your eye, you're seeing them with your mind's eye, but he does actually suggest in the Republic that we can think of that as being analogous to perception. Okay, so those are some views that Plato considers. Let's now look at some contemporary views and some other historical views as well. So, one of the central kinds of contemporary accounts of knowledge is an account that seeks to explain knowledge in terms of belief. I'll speak more generally of belief-based accounts as accounts which hold that to know that P is the case is for P to be true and for you to believe that P and for something else to be the case. And then the main question for defenders of belief-based accounts is to explain what that something else has to be. One important version of this view is what is sometimes called the JTB view. This view holds that the something else that you have to add to true belief to get knowledge is justification. So you know a truth when you believe that it's the case, and it is the case, and you have a good reason for thinking that it's the case, or a justification for thinking that it's the case. That's one version of the belief-based view. There are actually other versions. So another early version of the belief-based view that was considered is the causal view. This is a view according to which you know a truth when that truth causes your belief. So you know, for example, that Socrates is bald when the fact that Socrates is bald or was bald causes you to hold that belief. So obviously, if you lived in Plato's time and saw Socrates, your seeing him could be one of the mechanisms by means of which the fact that he's bald causes you to hold the belief that he's bald. That's another kind of belief-based account. And later, we'll be looking at a major problem for this kind of account. What I also wanted to do at this stage is to mention a different kind of account that was held throughout the history of philosophy by many philosophers, but that has kind of dropped out of the contemporary scene. And what I'm going to be suggesting is that it might be worth returning to this kind of view. So remember that I had said that Plato's view in the Republic is that knowledge is a sort of intellectual perception of the truth. It puts you in direct contact with the truth in the way that we naively think perception puts us in contact with the empirical world. This is a much more direct sort of account of knowledge. We take this idea of intellectual perception of truth and we just suggest identifying knowledge with that. This is a view that you can find throughout the history of philosophy and indeed in world philosophy. So in classical Indian philosophy, for example, you find a version of this idea according to which knowledge involves the presentation of reality to the mind. And the Sanskrit term for that concept of the presentation of reality is tattva anubhava. And you can also find this view in early 20th century British philosophy, and it's coming back now in some British philosophers that are inspired by this tradition. So the early 20th century philosopher John Cook Wilson held that knowledge is a mental state of apprehending truth that can't be further analyzed. But he still thought that it was sort of an important claim to make about knowledge, that it involves this sort of apprehension of truth, a grasp of truth. And that's an idea that has been coming back recently. We'll want to return to these accounts later, but what we're going to do now is look at a major problem for belief-based accounts. So, belief-based views require a kind of match between your thoughts and the facts. Matches can, of course, be accidental. So I usually just take socks out of my drawer, and if they end up matching, that's just an accident. The same kind of thing can happen with your views and the truth. Could be that your views are true, but it could just be an accident. You could just be making a lucky guess. Knowledge, of course, is supposed to be more than a lucky guess. And so we need to explain what it takes for the match between mind and world to not be accidental. And this turns out to be really quite a difficult task, because the obvious ways of explaining what it is for a match between your beliefs and the world to be not accidental end up facing counterexamples. So let's look at some of these examples. These examples are often called Gettier cases because they were made famous by the American philosopher Edmund Gettier. In fact, in the history of philosophy, you can find much earlier examples of these kinds of cases that just escaped Gettier's notice. So I'm going to actually be talking about those first. Okay, but what is the point of these examples? So earlier I mentioned that one of the versions of the belief-based account is the JTB view, the view that knowledge is justified true belief. Does this view give us a grip on what it is for the match between your mind and the world to be non-accidental? Well, it seems like it doesn't, because it seems like even if you have a good justification for your belief, you might still be right by luck. And this is what is shown by these cases that were made famous by Gettier, but which you can find much earlier. So, for example, you can find them in classical Indian philosophy. Philosopher Dharmottara had a nice example of this kind. So he imagined a case in which a desert traveler is searching for water, and he sees in the valley ahead a shimmering expanse. Unfortunately, it's a mirage, but fortunately, when he reaches the spot where there appeared to be water, there actually is water. So consider the desert traveler when he's setting out on his search and is trying to reach what he takes to be water. He has a good reason for thinking that there's water ahead because it looks like there is. And so his belief that there's water ahead is justified. It's also a true belief, but there's no connection between his justification and the truth, given that what he is seeing is actually a mirage, not the water that's there. That seems like a case in which the desert traveler doesn't really know that there is water ahead, even though he's right that there's water ahead, and he does have a reason for thinking that there's water ahead. That is an example of a Gettier case. You can also find cases of this kind in the Hindu philosopher Sri Harsha. So here's an example from him. He imagines a case in which you look at the mountain and see something which you take to be smoke. You infer that there is fire on the mountain. In fact, though, what you're seeing is fog, but it turns out that there is a fire on the mountain, so that your belief is true. So this again is a case in which you have a belief that's true and it's also justified, but because there's not the right sort of connection between your justification for holding the belief and its truth, it seems like you don't really know. So in this case, for example, given that you don't realize that what you're looking at is fog, and you take it to be smoke, you do have a justification for thinking that there's fire on the mountain. And so your belief, we can imagine, is justified. And it's also true, but given that what you're actually looking at is fog rather than smoke, it seems like this is not really a case in which you know that there's fire on the mountain, even though there is fire on the mountain. Now, at this stage, one move that you might make is to suggest that we should adopt a different version of the belief-based account. So you might say, for example, that there wasn't the right sort of causal connection in the example that we were just looking at between your belief and the truth. So what caused you to believe that there was fire on the mountain in the case we just considered was the fog which you mistook for smoke. Hence, you might think the causal view that we mentioned earlier might do a better job of explaining this case. But is that really right? Well, it turns out that it's not, because there are further examples in which your belief is caused by the fact that makes it true, but in which it's nonetheless, in some sense, just true by luck. And the most celebrated example of this kind is a case called Fake Barn County. This was made famous by Alvin Goldman, though in fact the case is from Carl Genet. So imagine this case. Henry drives into a part of the state that he's never visited before. He's looking at a real barn, and he has impeccable visual and other evidence that it is a barn. His justification is sound in every way, we imagine. However, in the rest of this unusual part of the state, there are only fake papier-mâché barns, any of which would have fooled Henry into thinking that it was a barn. So this happens to be the one real barn, and so his belief that it's a barn is true, and it's also caused by the presence of the barn. The reason why he thinks that there's a barn here is the fact that there's a barn here. Nonetheless, you might think there's a good sense in which his belief is just true by luck, because he so easily could have driven past one of the other fake barn facades and held the same belief. And so that also seems to be a counterexample to the causal version of the belief-based view, which requires that the truth of your belief cause your belief. Okay, so what is the lesson that we should draw from these examples? Well, Linda Zagzebski, in a great paper called The Inescapability of Gettier Problems, argues that unless we make justification infallible, so that the justification you have for your belief guarantees its truth, we'll inevitably run into cases of this kind. So unless you think justification has to guarantee truth, there's no way that you can hold the justified true belief account and avoid these kinds of examples. She also has a more general conclusion that she draws, which is that any belief-based account of the form knowledge is true belief plus X could only succeed by being redundant. Because if there's any kind of gap between X and your beliefs being true, then there will be a room for luck of the kind that gives us a basis for creating these examples. And so really the only way that you could have an account of this form that solves the problem is to stipulate that X entails true belief so that there's no gap. And that would make the account redundant in a certain way. It wouldn't even be necessary to have the true belief condition, because that would just fall out of X. So that is one of the lessons that is sometimes drawn. It's worth thinking, and I invite you to think about whether we have to go that far to avoid these counterexamples to belief-based accounts. It does look, though, like they're quite difficult examples. Okay, so let's think more generally about how you might respond to this problem for the belief-based account. And this will be fairly short. So as I see it, there are really three alternatives. The first thing that you can do is what Zagzebski suggests. You can adopt an analysis that adds something to true belief, which entails true belief. There are various contemporary philosophers who have accounts of this kind. Ernest Sosa has an account of this kind. he suggests that we should understand knowledge to be what he calls apt belief. What is apt belief? It's a belief that is true precisely because it's held in a competent way. So notice that the bold part of his account is a part that entails truth. The hope is that that kind of account will enable us to close the gap between mind and world in a way that excludes luck. But if you look at the literature, there are problems for even Sosa's kind of view. For example, the fake Barnes case, some people think, is a counterexample to his view, because if you imagine that case, it seems like your belief that it's a real barn is produced by your ability to recognize barns, and so it is a belief which is true because of the certain cognitive competence you have. Nonetheless, it still doesn't seem like knowledge. So the trouble is that even truth-entailing views actually seem to continue to encounter the problem. That might make you adopt an extreme kind of answer to our question. You might just say that there's no answer to the question, what is knowledge, that doesn't itself invoke the concept of knowledge. So this is what's known as the knowledge-first approach in epistemology. It's been made famous by Timothy Williamson, an Oxford philosopher, but it was actually defended earlier, including by one of the Indian philosophers that I mentioned, Sri Harsha, and was also defended by an earlier Oxford philosopher, John Cook Wilson, who held the same chair at Oxford that Williamson holds. So that's another sort of reaction that you could have. What I suggest, or what I think is right, is to go back to Plato and to adopt a traditional sort of account which doesn't try to break knowledge into parts, like belief plus something else, but which rather tries to identify it with something else that we might try to understand, which seems to illuminate the nature of knowledge. And so this idea that Theaetetus suggested at the beginning of Plato's dialogue, that knowledge is perception, is, I think, an idea that's worth exploring. If you adopt this kind of view, it doesn't really seem like you're going to run into the Gettier problem, but it also seems to be more than just the kind of account that Williamson gives, which is no account at all. The account that just says we can't really say anything informative about knowledge. So this, I want to suggest, is where the future of epistemology really lies. I don't think belief-based views are ever going to succeed, but I also think we can do more than people like Williamson think. And I think that involves going back and looking at the history of philosophy and thinking more about some neglected traditions that have really been ignored in contemporary epistemology. Okay, so anyway, thank you for listening to me talk about the nature of knowledge. I would be happy for you to get in contact with me if you would like. My email address is k.l.sylvan@soton.ac.uk. And if you were to study at Southampton, you could learn much more about all of these views that I've discussed.